Welcome back to the channel. This will be the penultimate team selection of this season for Gameweek 37 in FPL. You can currently see my FPL challenge team, with the challenge being Arsenal versus Newcastle. Any player from either club will get double the number of points. I only got 19 last week, but I'm aiming to do much better, not just the FPL challenge, but also in Fantasy Premier League with my transfer plans going into Gameweek 37 and 38. That will all be made clear in this video. And stay tuned for that Friday deadline stream so I can answer all your questions and make sure you're well prepared for the upcoming deadline. Also covering team news, injury updates, and much more. And if you want to see a best wildcard squad, then let me know down in the comment section below. Even if you have left it until late, the wildcard can still be very powerful for the last 2 game weeks of this season. And it can also provide some ideas about the best players to buy in every single position for your non-wildcard squads, and also to set yourself up for the last 2 game weeks of the season using that specific chip. Smash the like button of this video, subscribe if you're new, to let your feelings be known, to see that particular wildcard video, and also to see the remainder of the FPL and UCL fantasy videos for the season. So for match day 17, the plan is to do a best team video, combining the wildcard, the limitless, and also a squad you can build with normal transfers. My own team selection will be a separate video, and another deadline stream on the 31st of May for the Champions League final. Every single match day in UCL fantasy and Gameweek and FPL has been covered this season, with multiple videos and live streams to make sure you're well prepared for every single deadline. And check all the links in the description for my Patreon and the championships, for early access to my videos, amongst many other perks. The Discord server, FPL League, and Spotify can also be found in the description. Without further ado, let's jump straight into it. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Gameweek 36 has probably been one of the worst game weeks of the season for me personally, and I was very aggressive in the deadline stream. I took a -8 hit, but it just didn't pay off whatsoever. One of the few shining lights was for Verbruggen, who got 8 points, delivering a clean sheet and a bonus point against Wolves. He also made 4 saves, so I can't complain about Verbruggen at all. My other choice was David Raya away to Liverpool, and my plan was always to start Verbruggen in this particular fixture, and it did pay off big time. But as I will talk about very soon, there was one purchase I made from the same game that turned out to be a massive mistake in hindsight. In my defensive line, though, there was another star performer in Daniel Munoz, and even Gavardio chipped in with yet another clean sheet. Milenkovic was definitely the biggest disappointment from this defensive line, the only one to have blanked, and he conceded twice to Leicester at home, and Nottingham Forest now have 1 victory out of the last 6 matches in the Premier League. But Munoz's assist, the clean sheet in that 2-0 win away from home against Spurs, was very promising. 11 points overall. I mean, I've gotten a few of those returns from my defenders recently, particularly in the Gameweek 34 free hit a couple of weeks ago, so I'm very happy with that. And Gavardio has been one of my best signings on the Gameweek 30 wildcard, but he's also a very template pick, so I haven't gained too much from those clean sheets and bonus points. Unfortunately, though, things went completely south in the midfield. So Morgan Rogers got an assist, not too shabby, 6 points there, combining with Watkins, and having those two for the last 2 game weeks of the season looks very enticing. Brian Mbeumo got an assist, and compared to other template captaincy picks, that was also fairly solid. You look at Isak blanking, Mohamed Salah, and a few others like De Bruyne. They all massively disappointed this week, but that is where the big problems lie with my transfer plans and what I did in the recent deadline stream. I bought Kevin De Bruyne, and I sold Ismaila Sarr, who ended up getting an assist in that 2-0 win against Tottenham Hotspur. So that can happen, of course. And Ismaila Sarr, I think whether I sold him, Rogers, or Murphy, selling any one of them could have backfired immediately, and these things can happen. But in order to afford Kevin De Bruyne in the first place, I had to make some downgrades in other positions, and I completely changed my forward line essentially. Alexander Isak was the only one to remain, and he did nothing against Chelsea, despite the fact they went down to 10 men in the first half. But I bought Wissa, who got booked and delivered 1 point overall against Ipswich Town, and they only won 1-0, courtesy of a Kevin Schade winner. And I also bought Matheus Cunha. The 2 forwards I sold included Mateta and Marmoush, who was benched. So those 2 ended up blanking. That wasn't too shabby, and it could have been much worse based on how poorly these 3 players performed. So Kevin De Bruyne got 3, Cunha got 0 because he got booked and was subbed off before 60 minutes, and Wissa got 1. So between those 3 players and transfers, I got 4 points combined, and I took a -8 hit in order to bring every single one of them in. And then when you couple that with Ismaila Sarr's 6-pointer, Marmoush and Mateta getting 1-pointers each, I have lost out on a lot of points in the process, and it could have been much worse. Thankfully, Marmoush and Mateta didn't get significant minutes or really damage me, because that could have been the final nail in the coffin of an otherwise dismal season. But I tried something a little bit different. Of course, going for Chris Wood would have been slightly more appealing this week, but my kind of belief was that Cunha was a better option for the last 3 game weeks overall, for 36 all the way until 38. We'll see how that transpires, but so far it hasn't been good whatsoever. But the shining lights, of course, like I mentioned before, are Verbruggen, Daniel Munoz, Gavardio, Rodgers and Mbeumo did their job, and I got a somewhat decent captaincy score, but it's still nothing to write home about, and it wasn't enough to prevent a red arrow. As for my bench, what made things even worse for me is that I had Murphy and Livramento, who both delivered, and at one stage they were both in the bonus points, but only Livramento got that in the end with 7 overall, and Jacob Murphy was booked and delivered 5 points there against Chelsea, and David Raya blanked against Liverpool. The same goes for Saliba, but those 2 Newcastle players, if I had started at least one of them, and of course in an ideal world I would have started both, not taking the -8 hit, this red arrow turns into a significant green. It goes to show how tight the margins are at this stage of the season, and it's going to be a massive challenge to get into the top 100k from my position. But I've had a last couple of weeks that have been quite poor, to be fair, and it's a shame because before Game Week 33 I was on a great roll of green arrows, 10 in a row, but I haven't been able to translate that into consistent momentum, and my only recent green arrow has been on the free hit in blank Game Week 34. So as you can see there, I only got 52 points this week, and with the -8 hit taken into account, that's 44, and I got a red arrow to 184,000. So all that hard work that was really achieved with that free hit recently has all been undone in the last 2 game weeks, and it has been massively frustrating. I tried something a little bit different in the deadline stream and just didn't come to fruition, but that won't put me off from trying something maybe different for Game Week 37 and or 38. But I do look at my team for the upcoming deadline, and I feel it is actually looking quite solid for me, and making unnecessary changes could actually result in an even bigger backlash compared to what I just experienced in this Game Week 36 performance. But we'll wait and see how that goes. Before I talk about my transfer plans right now, let's discuss the prices as things stand. Verbruggen is at 4.6 million. David Raya went down recently to 5.5 million. The same goes for Saliba on my bench to 6.5 million. Munoz and Milenkovic are identical at 5.2, and Gavardio actually went up to 6.5 fairly recently. Rodgers is still 5.7. Mbeumo just continues to go up because he's a template option now, 8.3 million there. Mohamed Salah went down in price, I think, last week to 13.7, and Kevin De Bruyne is 9.6, with a lot of people transferring him in, especially for that Southampton fixture. Now, they might kind of have second doubts about that move. Vissa is 6.8 million. He has gone up astronomically in the last week or two. Alexander Isak is 9.5, and Matheus Cunha is 7.1, but I have massive regrets about buying him. That was the worst of those transfers, I think, and I don't think he's a bad option for the last 2 game weeks, but I think that performance, the early substitution, has definitely put me off him a little bit, and in hindsight, if I didn't bring him in last week, I probably would be looking elsewhere for the last 2 game weeks of the season, particularly for Game Week 38, where you've got Evanilson at home to Leicester, for example, and a few other players you can target in that forward line. I think one of Beto, Vardy or Delap could be great options this week as a 1-week punt, but I'm not that enthused about them for Game Week 38, so it's difficult to find forwards or players in general who you like for both Game Week 37 and 38 overall, but I think it's still possible, and that's what I'll identify in future videos, like the best wildcard team if you want to see it, and also the deadline stream on Friday. As always, let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. How did you perform in Game Week 36? And what are your transfer plans for the last 2 game weeks of the season? We can talk in the comments section of this video, the Discord server, and across my social media platforms like X, Instagram, and Blue Sky. But let's discuss my transfer plans for Game Week 37 and 38. My current plan is to roll, but I wouldn't rule out making a transfer in any of these positions. And if I were to make a goalkeeper transfer this week, David Raya would make way for Jordan Pickford. That is probably the biggest weak link in my starting 11 because Verbruggen is facing Liverpool at home and Raya hosts Newcastle. I think both of those teams will concede, and if you look at the stats and the clean sheet odds, Everton would be top, I think, facing Southampton at home, but they also aren't the most reliable of teams defensively now under David Moyes, so that isn't a locked-in transfer for me if I were to make a goalkeeper transfer, but I have to say it would be one of the most likely in this position. Now, moving on to other possible moves I could make this week, I am looking at Kevin De Bruyne to Jared Bowen, and I'm actually not able to afford De Bruyne to Palmer or Bukayo Saka right now, but that's something that is crossing my mind, and I could make that happen in Gameweek 38 by downgrading somebody else. For example, Cunha to Evanilson would give me the funds necessary to make this midfield upgrade, if you can call it that, and Jared Bowen would face Ipswich Town away for the final Gameweek of the season, and Kevin De Bruyne faces Bournemouth at home this week, and then Fulham away, and the minutes could still be managed there. I think he'll start both of those matches, but the FA Cup final could also have a huge bearing on Man City's team selection for the last few Gameweeks of this season. So that's something else to keep in mind there when making these particular moves. And another transfer is Alexander Isak to Ollie Watkins. That's something else that I'm aiming for here. And that's another way of achieving extra funds to make other upgrades in certain areas. And Watkins does look very appealing here, with Marcus Rashford potentially out of the picture for the remainder of the season. He might come back into the fold for either Gameweek 37 or 38, so let's see what Unai Emery says in his upcoming press conferences. But if Rashford is still not ready to start, I think Watkins is an astute purchase against Tottenham at home, and even against Man United away, he still looks encouraging, and of course both of those teams are there to be targeted, but Watkins does have the best of records against those clubs there. I think, for example, against Tottenham, he usually scores against them away from home and not at Villa Park, but he could definitely change that narrative in Gameweek 37. And Isak is still a good option to keep against Arsenal away. His previous record against them hasn't been great, and he did blank against the Gunners more often than not. But that has changed this season, with Newcastle getting 3 wins out of 3, not conceding a single goal, and Isak has scored in 2 of those 3 matches, including the winner at St James's Park in a 1-0 win there. So I think Isak can definitely cause problems to Arsenal and Everton, and he's a captaincy option there for Gameweek 38. But with all of that in mind, let's discuss my provisional Gameweek 37 team selection, and as things stand, the most likely scenario is that I roll. So in goal, that would mean David Raya at home to Newcastle. I'm not a massive fan of that, to be honest, and I think Arsenal will concede, but the Gunners will be higher than Brighton in terms of the clean sheet odds, and I don't think the Seagulls will be able to keep a clean sheet against Liverpool whatsoever. If Arsenal are on their A game, they have a chance against Newcastle, although even with certain key players returning from injury, so Declan Rice, Trossard, and we also have Kai Havertz in full training this season, and that could be a massive boost there for Arsenal. I still think they lack a little bit defensively right now with no Gabriel, and Newcastle will still fancy themselves to score some goals and create chances at the Emirates. In my defensive line, I've also got a solid platform of Munoz, Milenkovic and Gvardiol, which served me well in Gameweek 36, of course Milenkovic being the only exception there. But facing West Ham away and Chelsea at home, I still think it's worth keeping your Nottingham Forest assets, so Sells in goal, maybe one of your Forest defenders. I think having both of them simultaneously doesn't look as appealing right now than it did for Gameweek 36, facing Leicester at home. But Elanga in the midfield and Chris Wood up front, they're all solid choices, and Morgan Gibbs-White was the star in Gameweek 36 with a 13-pointer there. And Munoz is facing Wolves at home, so if I were to start Cunha, that would mean a direct clash there between 2 of my players, but this is one of those rare examples where a defender versus a forward facing each other could still result in both those players hauling, with Cunha getting goals and or assists, plus bonus points, and Munoz can always get an attack in return, even if Crystal Palace failed to keep a clean sheet. And Gvardiol is playing as a centre-back nowadays, and Man City are doing something a little bit different there. Could there be rotation? It is possible, and the main focus, I think, will be on the FA Cup final. That makes a lot of sense there, but they still have something to play for to secure Champions League football for next season. I think Man City will achieve that, and that has been apparent for quite some time now, but I still think they'll go quite strong here and rest a few key players perhaps, mainly in those attacking areas, and Gvardiol has been nailed on for pretty much the entire season. He can play as a left-back and also as a centre-half, his original position by trade, and he has been a very good FPL asset still because he can get bonus points, and the Citizens haven't scored that many goals, which I pointed out in my recent Transtips podcast. Now in the midfield, it's a solid template sort of team here, but at the same time you want something a little bit different to distinguish yourself, because this is the position where you can make the biggest gains and rank. No, Jared Bowen has definitely cost me in the last couple of weeks. He has returned in 3 consecutive game weeks there. The same goes for Eze, who is getting double-digit return after double-digit return. Morgan Rogers faces Tottenham at home, I think is a good option, and even for the captaincy, who could be considered. The same goes for Mbumo facing Fulham at home. They have been off it for quite a while now. And Salah facing Brighton away. I know the Liverpool squad went to Dubai, I think, to celebrate or kind of give Trent a farewell and stuff like that. But you can argue it one of two ways. The likes of Salah are well rested, or they don't have the same motivation and they haven't really shown the consistency with the goals and the assists that they did in the first half of this season. And Kevin De Bruyne facing Bournemouth at home, he has a good record against the Cherries, but I think the gap between both clubs has certainly closed in the last couple of seasons, and Bournemouth gave them really tough games in this campaign. They beat them 2-1 earlier this season at the Vitality Stadium, and in that same ground, Man City got their revenge in the FA Cup, with Marmoush scoring the winner to replace the injured Erling Haaland. But before that injury even occurred, we saw Marmoush and Haaland playing simultaneously on multiple occasions, and in recent matches we saw De Bruyne as the false nine and the Egyptian pushed to the right, and that has made him less of an appealing FPL asset. So I think with Man City you can't guarantee with any of these players that they'll start the remaining Premier League games and the FA Cup final, even with De Bruyne, who is leaving the club, and this is essentially his farewell tour, a bit like John Cena in the WWE. But De Bruyne has been a great player for Man City over the years, and I think he's a quality FPL asset on his day. He's got that high ceiling, but Man City aren't scoring that many goals or creating as many chances as they did back in the day. So I think De Bruyne is a good pick, but he is someone that is expendable at the same time, and that's something I'll probably discuss going into Game Week 38. Now, in my forward line, I've got a very solid list here of Wissa, Isak, and Matheus Cunha, and despite that clash between Munoz and Cunha, I think both of them could produce returns simultaneously, and this is arguably the best forward line you can actually build right now. But there's also Evanilson, who I like the look of for Game Week 38, facing Leicester at home. The likes of Delap, Vardy, and Beto are very appealing this week, but not so much for Game Week 38. You might argue against that in the case of Delap in terms of fixtures. And you've also got Watkins, who is the standout forward that I don't own right now, and one of Haaland or Marmoush could certainly haul in any given game, maybe even both of them, but it all depends on the minutes. And I think in the case of Marmoush, you can't really guarantee they will start both Premier League matches in 37 and 38, and the fixtures are reasonably tough on paper. On my bench, I've got a solid platform of Verbruggen, Murphy, Livramento and Saliba. So three of them will be playing each other in that Arsenal versus Newcastle game, and Verbruggen against Liverpool isn't too great, but I've got options there if needed as backups, and I think my weakest link for Game Week 37 is my goalkeeper. But in the case of David Raya, for example, there is still a somewhat decent chance of a clean sheet on paper at least against Newcastle, and then facing Southampton away in 38. That gives you a decent reason to keep him, and it's not a priority transfer or a must sell in my opinion. I think Arsenal can keep 1 out of 2 clean sheets for the remainder of this Premier League season, and if Arsenal were to keep 2 clean sheets in a row for the first time since August, it wouldn't be a huge surprise. I think against Newcastle it would somewhat shock me, but I think for others that might not be the case. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section. What would you change to this team? Would you make an aggressive transfer once more, or do you think subconsciously that -8 I took last week has basically put me off from going aggressive and finding those opportunities in these positions? I will be making another transfer this season, don't you worry. If nothing is done for Game Week 37, I'll put the 2 free transfers in 38 to good use, and I might even take a -4 hit to really add on top of it and be ultra aggressive there and chase those green arrows to rise up the mini leagues and the rankings. And before I go to fpl.team to visualize Game Week 38 and those potential moves, let's discuss the expected points for these players. So David Raya there has 4.2 despite facing one of the best teams in the country in Newcastle, and that is a battle for second place. Verbruggen is on the bench with 3.1. You've got Munoz, Milenkovic and Gvardiol with very similar numbers there. Milenkovic is just under 4, whilst the others have even better numbers in that regard. Rodgers is also very promising there for a budget midfielder, and Brian Mbeumo has always had a consistent 5.3 to 5.5 expected points according to Fantasy Football Hub, but they do favour Wissa slightly more, which is very interesting. Not every algorithm will share that sentiment, and Salah and De Bruyne are also very encouraging there, and Salah's always, in the 7 to 8 mark, even with the recent downturn in form, and Alexander Isak is at 5.3, and Matheus Cunha is still identical despite that early substitution in the last game. And on my bench, I've got Murphy, Livramento, and Saliba. And it might surprise you to see that Saliba's expected points is actually higher than both Murphy and Livramento. That doesn't really change my mind. I might put Saliba ahead of Livramento in the pecking order if I start to fancy Arsenal for a victory there. But I think Murphy is the best option on my bench, and it might even burn me to leave him there and not start him in Game Week 37. But ultimately, I sold Salah last week, and that could end up biting me, at least for Game Week 37 when Crystal Palace hosts Wolves. But I think Murphy is a solid option for Game Week 38 against Everton at home. And he also did fairly well against Arsenal this season. He got that goal in the Carabao Cup semi-final, the second leg. And I think Jacob Murphy has been one of the best budget midfielders in the game. And the captaincy is currently on Salah. There isn't a particular standout. And whilst the fixture is fairly decent for Liverpool, I don't think Salah's form is particularly great. Only one goal since blank Game Week 29. But as a midfielder, he has that advantage over the forwards in terms of getting an extra point for scoring a goal and the clean sheet points. And I think Salah with just one goal can still give you 10 plus very easily, and that'd be a great captaincy haul there over the other options. But I'm considering all the midfielders and forwards as a captaincy choice there for me. I think Cole Palmer, for those that do own him, would be a great shout against a struggling Man United side. And you've also got a few others like Ollie Watkins against Tottenham at home. I'll be compiling a top 10 captaincy list for the deadline stream on Friday, so be sure to check it out and see what my final ranking is. But I think it's completely open this week. And for Game Week 38, it's going to be also quite balanced, you could say, because a lot of the top players and the most consistent options in the midfield and forward line will have great fixtures on paper. But the same can't be said for Game Week 37 because you don't really have the form or the best version of these assets. And you also got probably tougher fixtures on paper, like Isak facing Arsenal away. And even with Salah, you'd probably fancy Crystal Palace at home a little bit more than Brighton away at the moment. But that is definitely debatable considering the form of both Brighton and Crystal Palace at this moment in time. Football isn't always played on paper. The same goes for FPL. But having David Raya and Saliba facing Southampton away looks much more appealing than doubling up on the Gunners defensively against Newcastle at home. I could also have Livramento facing Everton at home and Gavardio with a trip to Fulham for Game Week 38, and a midfield of Murphy, Saka, Mbeumo and Salah. And in order to sell De Bruyne to Saka, I would then fund Cunha to Evanescence. That would be the move that gives me the funds necessary. Isak and Vissa complete the starting 11 with Abragan, Rodgers, Milenkovic and Munoz all on the bench, and I've got 0.7 million approximately remaining. That could definitely change from now until the deadline, and the expected points is 55.4. Compare that to Game Week 37, which is significantly lower at 52.8, but that all depends on my final choice of captain and whether I stick with the starting 11. And to be fair, I think Livramento to Gavardio would change that to 54. So it's still lower, but the difference isn't as big there between Game Week 37 and 38 with expected points. But I will be making at least 2 transfers from now until the end of the season, and I might even make an additional one depending on injury, suspensions or other factors. But my current plan is to roll in Game Week 37 and then have 2 available moves, and that gives me more options there to potentially buy Saka, Cole Palmer or different players in that midfield, and it would mean selling De Bruyne, the most likely scenario anyway. I could also downgrade Isak, for example, and give myself a lot of funds to work with, and keeping Cunha at the same time and maybe going for Saka and Palmer in the midfield. That's something I wouldn't rule out, but that probably requires a -4 or a -8 hit overall to achieve, and it all depends on the players I sell and buy and whether I think that's actually worth doing. But of course, the last -8 hit I took was an absolute disaster, and I still think those players can do well for the last 2 games of the season, but I need them to hit the ground running ASAP, otherwise that will definitely go tits up. So hopefully your transfers worked out much better than mine in Game Week 36, and let's try to boost up the ranks and mini leagues for the final 2 game weeks of the season. All my videos on live streams will help you to achieve your goals there in Fantasy Premier League and use your fantasy, so stay tuned for all those pieces of content. That concludes the penultimate team selection video of the season, this time out of Game Week 37 in FPL. With only 1 free transfer and some poor form in terms of red arrows, it will become a massive challenge to finish in that top 100k, but it's still possible, and I'll do everything I can to make that a reality with my transfers, the captaincy decisions, and everything you need to know from team news, injury updates, and suspensions will be covered in the upcoming deadline stream on Friday. Thank you very much for watching this video and listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed it or found it insightful, then like this video, subscribe to the channel, and also hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single upload or live stream, both FPL and UCL Fantasy. Follow me on X, Instagram, and Blue Sky, DylanRCM, and check all the links in the description for my Patreon and the championships, for early access to my videos, amongst many other perks. The Discord server, FPL League, and Spotify can also be found in the description. I'll see you on Friday for yet another FPL deadline stream, and don't forget for UCL Fantasy on the 31st of May, I'll be going live for the Champions League final.